Leading Ideas Talks is brought to you by the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Subscribe free to our weekly newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leading ideas. Leading Ideas Talks has been brought to you by Discovering God's Future for Your Church. This turnkey video toolkit helps your congregation discern and implement God's vision for your church's next faithful steps. Discovering God's Future for Your Church is available on download and DVD at churchleadership.com/shop. How can churches get ahead of the curve by learning to anticipate change rather than always responding to change after the fact? Dwight Friesen discusses how churches can cultivate an imagination that thinks forward.
I'm Ann Michael. I'm one of the editors of Leading Ideas e-newsletter, and I'm the host for this episode of Leading Ideas Talks. I'm pleased to welcome today Dwight Friesen from Seattle School of Theology, who is co-author with Tom Sine of a very timely and provocative new book. It's called 2020's Foresight, 3 Vital Practices for Thriving in a Decade of Accelerating Change. So Dwight, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with me today and address this really critical subject of how churches can better respond to the context, a really ever-evolving, changing context of ministry. So welcome.
Oh, thank you. And it's so good to be with you. And I love the work that you all are doing, helping seed the imagination of leaders to your constituents and so on. It's such a timely thing for us to be considering, like, how do we think not just about the future, but how do we think Christianly about it? And how do we think about that as leaders, whether we're in a paid professional position or as lay leaders and everything in between, parents and teachers and all of that. Like, we all have influence. How do we think about it? So great to be with you.
Great. So I want to begin. Your book is really built around an interesting premise, and that is that we live in a time of such rapid and accelerating change that rather than always trying to respond to change after the fact, churches need to kind of get ahead of the curve, if you will, and learn to forecast and anticipate changes before they happen. And your co-author, Tom, used really a great metaphor, I think, from surfing, where he said, we need to learn how to catch the wave rather than getting hammered by it.
Exactly.
So I just wanted to give you a chance to speak to and explain that premise.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've been a part of church leadership and sort of strategic planning meetings for years in my pastoral work and in my academic work and church consulting. And what's striking to me is that so often we sit down and we begin to do our planning, and we think strategically, we think missionally about what we think we're called to do, but we often fail to actually look to the future and anticipate the changes that are coming our way. One of the ways that I think about this actually is I think of it as, as people who are seeking to follow in the way of Jesus, we generally hold to sort of a narrative understanding of the universe, right? We believe that there's a God who is creator, and there's an eschatological path that's where God is going to bring all things into the sort of the new creation, the dream that God has for us. But there's this narrative where we have creation, there's some kind of a rupture in all of that. God is restoring things and ultimately does that in Jesus Christ. And then we have the eschatological vision. We're really good at telling the parts of the story that look to the past and invite us to the present. We have not fostered the skill set as much to think about the future part of the story. Every story has a past, present, future component to it. And part of what loving our neighbors looks like, we try to explore in the book, part of what it looks like to love our neighbors well is to actually help them anticipate the changes and challenges that are going to come their way, so they're not blindsided when something that they could have actually planned for hits them. We can't predict. We're not saying you can be a prophet. We're not saying that you can know everything that's going to come your way, but there's actually a lot of data out there floating around. You can see it in the newsprint. You can see it on your news feed online or on your phone. That's helping us imagine what's coming down the road. I mean, just take climate change. Right now, I mean, as we're talking, it's kind of summer of 2021 heat wave, right? We're talking about some of the climate change kinds of things. Whether a person believes it or not, we're seeing changes. What could we do now to begin listening to that and planning for it accordingly? Anyway, so I say that to say, Part of loving our neighbors is helping them prepare well. Part of loving our faith communities is helping them prepare well. Part of loving our kids is helping them prepare well for the future. I mean, it's part of why we help kids make those plans to go off to college, and we anticipate what's going to come down their way. We can't predict it, but we have a pretty good sense of what might be there. So we try to think, how can we help them get there in a way that's wise, loving, and is more likely to produce the kind of character and being that they sense that God is inviting them to, and that's what this book is really about. Not just responding, but trying to anticipate.
Right. So I'm the kind of person that when somebody presents an idea to me, the first question that pops into my mind is how. I mean, that's just how I think, And I think as I was reading your book, I'm imagining a leadership team in a church, and they're given this task of trying to anticipate the changes that are on their horizon in the next 5 to 10 years. That's the time frame you talk about in the book. I mean, just how does a church get a window into the future? I mean, I know it's not a crystal ball situation, obviously, but what are some of the means and mechanisms that churches can use to anticipate?
Well, truly, you do not need to become a forecaster in any kind of professional sense in order to do this. The strategy there's lots of forecasting methods out there. Mm-hmm. What Tom and I talk about, we draw on the skill set of what's called probability forecasting, but I don't want to get into the technical side of that. Mm-hmm. Let's say your leadership team, let's say you're doing some kind of a retreat, or you just had one of your regular meetings, and you literally just asked the people in your group, your team, to just brainstorm some of the things that they've been hearing about that are likely going to impact themselves or their neighborhood or our country or the world in the next 5 to 10 years. No data, just brainstorm a list of things that are likely going to impact how we live the day to day. Fill your whiteboard. Fill another whiteboard. I mean, people already have an imagination. They've heard things. They've thought things. Mm-hmm. They can feel things. I'd actually say the Spirit of God is already daring people to imagine what the future is going to look like so they can prepare themselves. All we have to do is begin to listen to those things. What might happen? Mm-hmm. And then once you have that list up there, you begin asking yourselves, okay, given where we are specifically, as a faith community, as a person, as a people, given who we are as a tradition, and what kind of resources we have, given the particularity of our locatedness, what are we most likely to feel the impact of most directly? I think it's a really good starting place. It's not the only question to ask, but it's a really good one, because if you can begin to think, okay, I just heard a news report last night of a farming community in Southern California really impacted by the drought. Imagine a faith community that was saying, okay, over the next few years, we're going to actually anticipate a continuing drought and continuing difficulty with growing in our fields and so on. All of a sudden, you begin saying, okay, well, that's happening right in our backyard. I wonder what's the invitation here. God isn't caught off guard by these kind of changes, these kind of ruptures, these kind of things that are happening. This is part of reality. So where and how could this thing then be an invitation for us to actually discover a way of love? So the whole goal really is to just pay attention to what might be there, what could we do, and how might we begin? You were going to say?
So, yeah, well, I was going to ask, I mean, there's a lot of trends that you mentioned in the book. I mean, climate change and increasing diversity and polarization and technological advances. But I mean, what are the kind of changes that a local congregation really should be focusing in on if it were doing this work?
I would have to say I would hesitate to be prescriptive on that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important. The primary skill set that we're highlighting throughout this book is deep listening. Okay. There is not an assumption or a prescriptive message around what one must do. The question is, who are you as an individual? Who are you as a community? Where are you? And given who you are as a community, how might your neighbors and your neighborhood need to experience the love of Jesus through you? It's far more particular. It's far more located.
Right.
And so it really is about actually almost intentionally rejecting the trends being talked about on the stage or from the media or from the news, and saying, okay, let's listen to our neighborhood closely. Let's listen to those right around us. I mean, that ongoing dare from Jesus to say the way you demonstrate your love of God is by love of neighbor as love of self. It's that in practice, but with the future orientation. How do we help people listen to the future so they're not blindsided by it?
Yeah, so it's hyper local then. I mean, community based.
It really is. It really is. That's the best way to go. Like, I'll give you well, here's a little example. This one didn't make it into the book because it was, but it's a really fun one. In North Bend, there's a youth pastor named, her name just flew right out of my mind. Presbyterian. Anyways, Schmidt is her last name. Throughout her ministry there, they've always had a bulletin board in their youth room that had two simple questions on it. What do you have and what do you need? And the invitation was to simply, if you have extra of something, to post it, if you'd be willing to share it. And if you need something, to post your request. And then it created a culture of sharing within the neighborhood. And they built this capacity to give and to share, to receive. It was kind of a lovely thing for their youth group or for their young adults ministry. When the pandemic hit and all of a sudden they couldn't have access to their building, overnight, she took that bulletin board and she went online with it and created a Facebook group. Mm-hmm. And over the course of about 3 or 4 months, they activated over 10,000 people from the city of North Bend to give and to share stuff. She's been featured all over the place. But here's my point, though. My point is that by simply paying attention and listening to the local context and saying, okay, what do we already have in our system? What they had in their system was a way of like asking the question, what do we have? And what do we need? It was in their narrative. It was in their way of being. And all of a sudden, there was a crisis that happened in the neighborhood, in the community. And they said, we could extend that. And by simply taking that conversation that had been private and opening it up, they were able to activate, as I say, thousands of people from the community beyond their church. And many, many people were helped and served along the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, that's helpful to me. And I'm glad you mentioned the pandemic, because I have to say, as I was reading the book, and, it's clear that you were writing it as the COVID crisis was coming on the scene.
Yeah.
I think that was so much top of mind for me. And what I was thinking to myself was, oh my goodness, I mean, I know there were scientists and,
mm-hmm.
Medical people who could have told us that a global pandemic was coming, but not a lot of people really had anticipated that in a good way. And how could a church have anticipated the major changes that have happened in the last 18 months as a result of the pandemic?
That's a really good point, Anne, because it's never really about anticipating the particularity. Like no one said, no one was anticipating there's going to be a COVID-19 pandemic. What the orientation of anticipating work is it builds within the community an imagination that has us thinking forward, so that our immediate reaction when a crisis hits is not simply retreating and pulling back and kind of protect my own, but it fosters an imagination that says this is our opportunity to discover a way of love. This is an opportunity to follow Jesus into a new way of being, drawing on who we are. Drawing on our little cork board in our youth room. We're not trying to all of a sudden become something else. The question is, how do we tap into the formational life that we've been living as a community and use it as a way to lean into rather than retreat from whatever the crisis may be?
Yeah, that's helpful, because I the more I thought about the example of the pandemic, as I've been studying a lot of things in church life related to the pandemic, I've been of the opinion that it didn't really make change as much as it accelerated changes that already
Exactly.
were needed to happen. And I think, churches may not have been able to anticipate that COVID-19 was going to happen, but forward-thinking churches should have been able to anticipate that they needed electronic giving and that they needed to be leaning into the digital frontier and they needed to be working to build community in new ways. And so,
That's right.
some of the changes that have come about as a result of the pandemic were things
Right.
that you could have anticipated.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And throughout the book, we use three primary sort of dance steps as kind of our little. We talk about anticipating as step one, reflecting, which is step two, and then innovating, which is step three. Which, to be honest, I mean, although it's our language, we're really drawing on the ancient Christian practice of Benedictine Lectio Divina. That's really what we're talking about. There's this kind of like by anticipating, we're talking about like that deep listening, opening up. What is being said? What are we seeing? What are we hearing? What's the Spirit of God inviting us to see with fresh eyes? What's shimmering in our hearts? It's just kind of paying attention to what's there. Then we reflect on the data that we're hearing, but maybe even most importantly for those of us as followers of the way of Jesus, what do we understand as the shalomic imagination of God? What is God's dream for us and for humanity and for the globe? And how does that then dare us to think not out of fear, but out of love and of hope and of the creation of something new and beautiful for ourselves and for our neighbors and our globe? And then once we begin to reflect on what might be possible, then the question is, how do we, not the church writ large, how does my family innovate and do something small it's almost like a little dare to say, what if I actually thought this shalomic possibility could be, like, what if I actually believe God could redeem this? As though God could take what man meant for evil and uses for good. Like, it's that kind of a pivot. It's a resurrection mindset.
Or kingdom living. I think I would call it kingdom living. And I think your point at the beginning is very well taken, that we forget that the Christian faith is future oriented.
That's right.
And that, God is pointing us to the kingdom, and we're invited to be harbingers of it. And I do think that that's what your book is inviting people to do.
That's right.
Yeah, I want to shift gears just a little bit and sort of turn attention to some of the things you do in the latter half of the book. And I don't think I'm overstating your case to say that it sounds to me like you and Tom believe that if the church in America is going to survive in an increasingly post-Christian world, that it's going to be in a radically different form. And in the second half of the book, you present a lot of examples of individuals and couples and families and small communities that are living into what you call a whole life approach to faith.
Yeah.
So can you share a bit to help our listeners understand what you mean by that? Maybe some examples?
Sure. I don't exactly know how it happened, but it does feel sometimes, I don't know if you feel this at times, but it sometimes feels as though that Christianity or following Jesus sometimes gets just reduced to like this, like add-on to my otherwise well-lived life. Like, as long as I go to church, pray a few prayers, sing a few songs, give a little bit here or there, that somehow that's adequate. I don't want to say that. That sounds really judgmental. That's not what I want to say. It's not what I want to say, because that's a great place. It's much more. I think I can speak for Tom and I when we say that when we believe that following the way of Jesus is the best way to live. When we see Jesus, we're seeing the mystery of fully God and fully human. And what we see in Jesus is a person who lives for the sake of others and for the sake of community in a way that is self-emptying to the flourishing of all. And that somehow that's not simply a add-on to my life. That is a whole way of being. That is a deeply holistic imagination for following in the way of Jesus.
Yeah. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I mean, I think being familiar with some of the examples in your book, it's the difference between going to church and being church.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of them are sort of creative. You talk about creative new expressions of church. I mean, some of our listeners will be familiar with Fresh Expressions movement.
Oh, sure.
I mean, is that the direction that you see the Christianity in North America moving?
I mean, no, I'm not. I would probably go even beyond Fresh Expressions. I mean, I think even more than being church, I think there's a kind of discovering church. I think we're at the tail end of the Christendom imagination for church, in which there was a collusion of church with state that we ended up sort of parsing down into denominationalism, and everybody sort of, it's like denominations are a little bit like franchises, each trying to carve out a piece of their pie with their distinctive flavor. Of course, I'm part of a denomination. You're part of a denomination. Most of us are. That's not a bad thing, but I think when God looks at any one of our neighborhoods or cities, I think God sees the church as those people who are seeking to follow in the way of Jesus. If that's the case, what would it look like to actually discover a new way of being church? The question that the neighborhood invites us to do when we're listening deeply to our place and we're trying to discover a new way of being church that's less about keeping our market piece, our piece of the market pie, and more about living in the day-to-day, is all of a sudden we're asking ourselves, how do we actually learn to fit together as the church in our place as an actual body of Christ where we need each other? And I think that's the thing that's been most encouraging to me through the pandemic, is finding followers of Christ in neighborhoods who are actually joining together across denominations for the sake of supporting each other and their neighborhoods.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's a very deinstitutionalized vision, and I think it's one that's probably very compelling, especially to younger generations who are turned off by the institutionalism of our traditional churches, our denominations, and other institutions. I guess it does cause me to ask, though. I mean, do you see a role for traditional congregations and denominations and other institutions in this future? If this is if this is the green growing edge of the Christian faith, in your opinion, what is there a role for more traditional Christian communities?
Yeah, I think there is a role for them. The church has been very adaptable. I think that's going to be the key. The denominations and the traditional churches that carry on will be the ones who lead the way in adaptability. There's no question to me about that. I'm not opposed to church structure. I'm not in any way, I'm not an anti-institutionalist. To me, institution and the kind of spirit of church that I'm talking about, they have to go together. It's almost like body and soul. Like if the body is the corporeal part of my being, but the soul is that which animates it, to be a human being, I am both of those things. I am structure and I am spirit. In that sense. And I think the church requires that too. So even if the church institutions and structures change, it's still going to require systems and structures.
Thank you. This is very helpful. I mean, obviously the book is has a spiritual tone to it, but I think you're bringing a new level of sort of theological understanding to what it is that you're envisioning. So I appreciate that. I want to shift gears yet again. I understand that you are a church planter.
I have been. I'm not anymore.
A church planter. Yeah. But I do think you do address sort of different ways of thinking about church planting. How do you see the concept of church planting? Maybe that isn't even a good term anymore, but how do you see that unfolding in the future?
Yeah, it's a contested term, isn't it? But both of those words have problems to them in some respects. I don't know how to get away with from the word church. I love the word. I love the church. That's been my calling, to serve Christ by serving Christ's church. But I don't like the word planting anymore. I try to avoid it now. And the reason for that is because to be a church planter, it kind of holds this notion that I know what kind of church needs to be over there. And if I'll go there like Johnny Appleseed and plant that seed, we know what will emerge. And again, none of this language is perfect yet. I think as a culture, we're still trying to discover what that new language is that serves Christ and Christ's church well. But I like the language of church discovering, like discovering the church that wants to be birthed in a given place. Because I don't believe that, I don't believe that God wasn't at work in a place prior to the church planter showing up. Right. I believe God is always present, always at work, and so it's less about the planter executing their vision and more about listening and surrendering their own vision and joining what God's already doing, uniting those who are maybe even the warring factions within that given place, discovering the redemption narrative that's particular to that place. Like,
well, that's the way modern missionaries approach their work. I mean, I don't think it's
this is nothing earth-shattering. This is nothing new. There's nothing truly new under the sun in this regard, right? But it is a matter of deep listening and surrender.
So I want to draw this to a close, and often when I'm talking to people on these podcasts, I like to end by thinking about first steps. A lot of our listeners, they're pastors, maybe they're congregational leaders. Many of them are in fairly traditional congregational settings. If based on the model that's in your book, what's a good first step that a leader in a typical church today can take to kind of begin to get ahead of the curve and live into some of these changes that you're describing?
Yeah. This might sound way too simple. And
no, simple's good.
I would say start walking your neighborhood regularly, different times of the day. Walk it alone, walk it with other people. Walk it. Don't just walk your dog and wait for your dog to do its business. Actually walk it with the anticipation that the Spirit of God will speak to you through it. Your neighborhood, the place where you are, like the context of your faith community. That's one of the primary ways God teaches us to discover to discover presence. How do we listen and assume and just anticipate that the Spirit of God is going to speak to us through it? Discover the narratives. Who are the heroes there? Who are the villains? Whose voices are not heard? Who gets marginalized? What are the systemic oppressions that maybe you haven't thought of, or maybe that are present to you all the time? And let those break your heart. Let them open your imagination. Notice the changes in those things. The reality of where we are. In some ways, what I'm saying is listening to our place as bodied creatures in this time, body, place, and time. These are the primary guides that God uses to help us discover presence and discover His way. And I would say that that's the starting place. And then to dare to ask, with all of the things that you see that could be different, that could express the kingdom of God, what resonates with your community's history? What would break your community's heart? What would say, oh, we could do something about this? We can't do it all. But we're here, and this is happening, and that's our thing. And then,
thank you for that, because I mean, in a way, you make that sound simple, but I think we have so many ways of detaching ourselves from the reality that surrounds us, that the simple act of opening our eyes and allowing ourselves to see our neighbors through God's eyes is really a radical thing. And so I think it's a very provocative and amazing suggestion that you make. Dwight, I want to thank you for sharing so candidly about your ideas, and really, I think, putting a broader theological frame around your work. So again, the book is 2020's Foresight, 3 Vital Practices for Thriving in a Decade of Accelerating Change. So thank you for sharing today. Thank you for all of the really interesting information that's in this book, and best of luck to you.
Oh, thank you, Anne. It's been such a gift to be with you.
On the next Leading Ideas Talks, Alan Stanton lays out a new vision for healthy rural congregations as valued stakeholders and potent agents of change within their communities.
In a lot of our rural communities, the fastest growing population is actually rural recent retirees who are moving out of their urban and suburban places into rural communities where there's more affordable property. They have a slower pace of life. They have disposable income that will go further in these communities. And so when we're advertising to churches, like you need to increase the size of the youth group or you need to increase your children's programming, but we're ignoring the single largest demographic that's moving into these communities, we're really not doing effective ministry, right? And so by focusing on a population that is not actually present in that community, we miss out on the gifts that are already there. So I think when we're looking at rural places, we have to kind of figure out like what are the demographics of that particular community? What are the actual changes that are taking place in that community? And then approach a conversation about vitality and not just kind of default to what worked in a suburban place or what worked in an urban place, because rural places are not just like little urban communities, right? They're different. They behave differently.
Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe free to our weekly newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leadingideas.